You're listening to the Modern Mainframe, BMC's intelligent C optimization and transformation podcast, covering the latest trends and issues in the mainframe and how BMC AMI solutions can help you make change your competitive advantage.
Hello there. Welcome to the Modern Mainframe. I'm Matt Dallaire. Joining me today to discuss security hardening and the mainframe's role in it are BMC Senior Product Manager David Lee and Practice Lead Manager Julian Bridges. David, Julian, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Hi, Matt. Yeah, thank you for inviting us on.
Recently, BMC released an ebook covering the top 7 security priorities for mainframe leaders. I'll include a link to the ebook in the show notes. Today, we'll be discussing one of the priorities mentioned in the ebook, hardened security configurations. David, can you give us a quick explanation of security hardening in general and why it's important?
Yeah, absolutely. So security hardening is the process of kind of taking a look at your system and seeing where all the weak points are, all the holes in the system, as to say, and going through the process of addressing them, and then rolling that into a continual process to ensure that you're safe going forward. There is a term that's not so used in mainframe, but a terminology that's making its way into the mainframe called attack surface management, to make that surface as small as possible. Why is it important? To stop you getting breached. In essence, would you agree with that, Julian? Is the main reason that protect your data?
Protect your data. Yeah, exactly.
And why do we want to protect our data and not have breaches? For all the things that come with a hack, be that fines, regulation, reputational damage, or not so much for kind of big clients of ours and the financial sector, but for smaller users of infrastructure, it can lead to kind of loss of operating if they can't recover from an attack.
So traditionally, has the mainframe been included in security hardening practices?
So very much not. Certainly over the past few years, that's come to change. But in the early days of mainframes, security was performed by the system programming team. Wasn't possibly even thought of as a separate discipline within system programming. And therefore, a lot of bad practices crept in, a lot of misconfigurations and vulnerabilities were found on the system. And generally, the auditors didn't even look at things. So, as we're saying, that's starting to change. The auditors are aware of a mainframe, and the system programming team are knowing that the mainframe is important. Your crown jewels, your vital data is on there, and therefore it's no longer out of scope. It should never have been out of scope in the first place, but it should absolutely be there. Do you agree with that, David?
Yeah, absolutely. A statistic which kind of varies between 75 to 85%, but we kind of talk about 80% of enterprise data resides on the mainframe. The fact it was ever out of scope is kind of unforgivable, really. But that is what it is, and we are here now. So I guess moving on through kind of from defining it on why it's important and whether it's in scope. So you lead the security services team. If a client came to you and asked, I'm in a complete mess and I don't even know where to start, what would you say to them?
So we need to find the scope of the problem. So the best way of doing that is to have a look at your system, and that could be via a penetration test, but we also recommend that you do a full security assessment. And that means a penetration tester user wouldn't have any ability to look at the system, and we might find one or two vulnerabilities where you can be breached. But with a full security assessment, we'd ask for privileges on your system to have a look around and get a good understanding of the configuration of the system, find any issues that are there, and provide a report and recommendations on how you can remediate your system and therefore harden it.
Okay, so starting with going away and looking at the system and going through a full kind of health check for it. So is that just the security manager, RACF, ASIF2 or top secret, or would you recommend going a bit more in depth?
Oh, no, very, very much more in depth. The security manager is important. That is where the security controls for a lot of the system are, but a lot of the vulnerabilities will be in the configuration of the system. So if you can bypass the security manager because of misconfigurations we always talk about, and in fact auditors are starting to look at APF authorization on the system, that sort of thing, then you could bypass the security manager. So very much a case of looking at the system as a whole. And that's not just ZOS, the system, that's looking at the subsystems as well. So that includes KICS, DB2, IMS, MQ. They all have potential vulnerabilities, and we'd recommend a holistic view of the system, looking at everything.
So I think it's important when it comes to security that we don't mark our own homework, as to say. Would you give any other kind of reasons why it's important that you have an external organisation do a security assessment rather than doing it in-house?
Yes, the external security company or whoever's going to be doing the assessment will be looking at it from an industry best practices point of view. They won't know where the bodies are buried necessarily, and therefore can give an industry view of the vulnerabilities of what the best practices are and how things can be looked at.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing I think we should touch upon here as well. So we're kind of at the point where we know we've got a problem. We've brought in an external body to carry out assessment of the system. Now we're looking at the mainframe only, and I think one thing we found is that you'll often have this grey area in the middle, which is perimeter security on the mainframe as well. So you'll have your network team looking at the networks in general in whatever organisation, and then we'll now have the mainframe coming under scope with this hardening process going on. There's that bit in the middle where it's things like the REST APIs or the ODBC connections and this kind of stuff, where a non-mainframer could potentially breach the system. It's really important that grey area is covered. It becomes a bit political. Would you agree, Julian, when it's technically not your job, but someone has to put their head above the parapet and kind of let it be known that there could be a potential problem?
Yeah, but because there is a gap there, that's exactly it. They should be looked at. Mainframe penetrations are likely to be performed by people who don't necessarily know mainframes, and therefore industry standards, like you say, RESTful calls or just getting into Unix system services is an environment that's familiar to many. So if you could somehow SSH into the mainframe, you end up with an environment that people are familiar with and know where the vulnerabilities are. And therefore, it's vital that everything's looked at. So both the network and USS, as well as the subsystems, are something that should be part of the security assessment.
And one thing I will add there, with the mainframe being around the longest in a lot of enterprises, that can also lead to the technical debt being the highest. So some things that would be a horror story for non-mainframe may be very accepted as risks. Talking not only weak key sizes for encrypted connections, but non-encrypted connections is not unusual for what we find when we're doing one of these security assessments.
Yeah.
So we've done the assessment. Now we've got the results. How, from the report, how would we break down? How would we look at, say, what we can look at to do first? What would your next steps be to a client of ours if they've done a security assessment?
Certain things that come out of the assessment are, we're looking at, could an attacker escalate their privileges? Could they access data that they shouldn't be able to do? Would anybody have seen what they're doing? So that's an important thing. Is there monitoring and alerting on the mainframe? So the security assessment will list recommendations on how these types of issues could be remediated. And then would you work with the team to try and remediate those issues? Or could you work with the team to try and remediate those issues?
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, so in terms of a finding, then it's obviously scored. So the scoring is based on its ease of exploit, likelihood, and what's the third?
The impact of that vulnerability.
The impact of the vulnerability, yeah.
Yeah, in my opinion, that's the most important criteria in a scoring, is what would be the effect of this happening. So.
Okay, so we've just had our report back. So our quick wins would be the easy ones to remediate with the high impact.
Yeah. Go with the highest impact, and then have a look at how easy it is to remediate it. Yeah.
So kind of an example of a high impact would be something like an unprotected APF library.
Yes, that's the classic example. And as I say, that's actually something auditors are now coming round to and understanding that that is a vulnerability. But that's one of many. If that's all they're looking at, then there's a lot more that we would recommend be remediated.
Yeah, we should also add is when walking through the hardening process and the remediation, often the reason a system's got into its state is kind of lack of investment, but also being left out of enterprise process. As we're going through a transformation on the mainframe in approach to security, it's the perfect opportunity to bring the mainframe in line with enterprise standards in terms of process. So everything needs to go through ITSM, everything needs to go through change approval, start attending CAB with these things. Due to the nature of the mainframe and where it sits in the enterprise, these changes can be done without issues, but things do happen. Yeah, it's important that we have got a full record of what was done so we can roll back, particularly when it's things like locking down APF libraries, which could cause an outage potentially if the investigation into doing the change isn't carried out thoroughly enough.
Ideally, who would be initiating this and who would be overseeing it? Would it be somebody specific to the mainframe, or would it be somebody from enterprise security?
So we are talking specifically on this podcast about mainframe security, but the initiation of it is often driven by audit. So that is normally a general IT persona. They will look after security for the enterprise. Sometimes that is broken up into a bit more granular. So that will be then delegated to perhaps a security auditor who looks after the mainframe only. Would you agree with that, Julian, or have you observed differently?
Yeah, it's always good to have the auditors as your friend, both in your own organisation. You could use them to get the ability to fix things that you know are a problem until they're highlighted by the auditors people. But yeah, it's the security teams within the organisation that are likely to request this. And it, like you say, enterprise-wide, but make sure the mainframe's included as part of that enterprise-wide.
And it's more than just a one-time thing, right? It's more than just a one-time exercise. You're going to want to make it into an overall strategy. What actions need to be taken to ensure that the practices are up to date and that you're going along the right road?
Yeah, it's very much a continuous process. So just because you're secure today doesn't mean to say you're going to be secure tomorrow. So this should be an annual exercise that you're testing your security, you're constantly probing it, as well as having real-time monitoring, alerting of everything as it's going along. So we'd recommend that the processes as part of your improvement of your services have annual assessments.
Yeah, the great thing about having the assessment is that we've now got kind of an effort estimate on what it's going to take. You've got to remember addressing the issues and the findings from the assessment. They are not in the team's BAU time allocation, which means someone's got to do that work. And having an externally carried out security assessment means that there is feasible evidence to try ask for budget to get more people involved with the process. Just because it becomes continuous service improvement, it's still not BAU. It is very much a project. Tackling this as BAU is completely the wrong approach. It's got to be done as quickly and thoroughly as possible. And it needs to be, as Julian said, it needs to be repeated on an annual basis to keep validating where the holes are, but also highlight where there may be new vulnerabilities in the system. Be that because the organisation carrying out the assessment has come up with new findings to look for, or due to the kind of ever sliding window in IT with upgrades and updates that the system that was once fine in one area has now become vulnerable due to an exploit being available.
Absolutely.
So, Julian, do you have any final thoughts, any final takeaways to share?
One of the areas from security assessments that we do look at is what we call footprinting. So an attacker's going to want to know what's running on the system, what's how the system's laid out, and where the vulnerabilities are. A lot of the findings that we're going to find in the security assessment will be around the ability to find that information, which isn't necessarily an exploit or a vulnerability, but it's certainly something that we should be locked down. So reading parameter files, that sort of thing, you don't want everybody on the system to be able to do that. only those with a valid business need. It's a big area now, just locking down the ability to footprint the system.
David, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think if you're listening to this podcast or kind of reading the blog series at BMC, you've taken the hardest step, and that is starting it. It is a really difficult thing to start if you feel the security of your system needs to be hardened. It's really tricky to know where to start, and it's a gargantuan task. But this is the first step. It's starting to do the research on where to begin. I think building on what Julian said about footprinting as well is a great final note to finish on. 95% breaches happen through human error, be that a user with elevated privileges doing something accidentally, thinking they might be on dev and they're actually on production, or again, human error in the fact that they've made an error in a config file that's made its way to production. So the threat is not necessarily a bad guy somewhere in another part of the world wearing a balaclava tapping away at the keyboard. Threat may be internal.
This is an important topic, and as you mentioned, it's a big task. It's good that people are taking the first step. So, Julian, David, thank you for taking some time today to discuss it.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
And thank you also to our listeners. I'll include some links to more information in the show notes, including, as David mentioned, the blog series and the ebook Top 7 Security Priorities for Mainframe Leaders. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time on The Modern Mainframe.
You're listening to The Modern Mainframe, BMC's intelligent C optimization and transformation podcast, covering the latest trends and issues in the mainframe and how BMC AMI solutions can help you make change your competitive advantage.